If you guys recall last week, I told you last episode, I told you I had a question prepared for you, but then it got derailed because Garrett made fun of me for supposedly not liking sports, which we put on the record that that's not true.
Kenna's a big fan of sports.
Sports.
Let it be known.
I do like sports.
Yeah, I know.
Once again.
I'm just clearing that up for the people.
Thank you. But I haven't forgotten about my original question.
Oh, good.
So that's what I'd like to ask you all today.
Please.
Is this, Molly, do you remember? Because I told you and I told you to forget it so that you'd be.
I'm going to be honest with you. It's been on the sheet that we've been working off of today. So I'm not going to lie to you. I've seen it again. So even if I had
am
forgotten,
completely unaware, like most things. So here we are.
At least you're aware that you're unaware.
Amen.
Okay, here's the question. What is the most memorable trip you've ever taken?
It's a great
And why?
question.
I can begin. I would say
He's ready, even
The
though he
only
didn't know the
person who
question.
didn't have any time to think about it.
Uh-huh.
Classic
off,
Josh.
off the cuff.
Ooh, can I guess?
You can guess, Molly.
Is it when you went to Asia?
It is.
Ding, ding,
Thailand,
100
Cambodia.
points for
Wow.
Molly.
You went to all of Asia? That's a large continent.
I did.
I then specified, thank you.
I went to Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia for a month in 2015 with two of my best friends. And
Shout out.
shout out Josh and Caleb Fleming if you're listening.
Oh, wow.
And we had, I would say that's probably my most memorable trip because it was the first trip I did completely on my own. I mean, we had friends there, but it wasn't like I was with my family or with parents or anything. And it was the first time I had really gone outside of the country. So that trip, especially with how long it was, is definitely the most memorable because I think that it was, I mean, I survived. So one, I didn't know I could make it. I didn't know I could make it on my own for a month traveling around the world.
Weren't you in college this whole time, like on your own?
Yeah, but it's different. Like a whole new culture, a whole new environment, like trying to figure out how to get where to go, you know? And I made it. So that was a big thing.
You did it.
Did it. And yeah, that was the most memorable trip.
Did you do anything fun or funny?
We did a lot of fun things. We went to Angkor Wat, if you know what that is. It's in Cambodia. It's this big, like, ancient city that still has all its ruins there.
Oh,
that's super, super
That sounds
cool. We put our feet in one of these tanks where the tiny little fish eat your skin.
You did.
Yes, and it tickled ridiculously, so didn't last very long.
I bet you looked so dweeby. You
Oh,
were probably laughing
100%.
so hard.
We stood out way too much because we were like these three young white guys walking around. We were the only Americans we met on the whole time we were there.
Really?
Wow.
So we stuck out like a sore thumb, especially when Caleb would wear his USA t-shirts. So,
Nice.
Classic. That's amazing.
Yep.
Josh, did you guys play any sports, specifically any American sports with them?
yeah, we did. We played basketball and we played football.
That felt like a leading question.
We
Well,
played.
I remember briefly like them talking about something about how they were like sports gods in American sports over there.
It was amazing. I've never felt so athletic in my life. We bought a football and was throwing football around in a park, and there were multiple people who came up to us who were like, "Are you professional? Like, do you play do you play in the like
That's good.
professional football?" Because they were like, "You're so good at this," and we were like, "You have no idea."
This was right around the time, I believe, of the intramural team, Tim Tebow's youth group
That's what it was.
from Western Washington intramurals.
That was our intramural team name, Tim Tebow's youth group. And we went to 4 straight championships.
And how many did you
lost
lose?
4 in a row, just like the Buffalo Bills. And then we won
Then they got
our
Josh
final
Allen.
year.
Wow.
Are you guys John?
Except they lost.
Were you John Kelly? Was that it?
I was the offensive lineman who wasn't fast enough to catch anything, so I was the guy who occasionally went into the game and didn't do that much.
Good times.
Dude, I love sports.
Good time.
Yeah?
That's right,
Yeah.
Kenna. This is your chance to
Who's Tim Tebow?
You don't have to know who someone is to
Yeah,
appreciate
don't
their
patronize
sport.
her, Josh.
I'm asking curiously.
Because you don't know who Tim Tebow
I
is.
don't know who he is.
He needs to be
I've been
educated.
confused
John's
since
getting put
freshman
on
year of college.
He plays football.
Mm.
And I'm pretty sure he's a Christian.
There you go.
And baseball, actually.
That's basically what he's known for.
He got drafted.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Sports. Really swole. He's so big.
And he used to do this when he would get a touchdown, like pray in the end zone.
Yes.
All the glory to God.
Oh, gosh.
It was okay when he took a knee.
Oh.
Yeah.
That was sarcasm. Just
a little
for
sarcastic, y'all.
Just for the record. Are there people most memorable trips?
Okay. Mine's tied, and I already know that when I say it, it's going to sound kind of pretentious, but I've only gone to 2 cool places in my life. I mean, that's not true. I've gone to a lot of cool places, but like really cool places out of the country. But I think they're the 2 coolest places that you can really go.
Man, you are hyping this up.
And so I took a trip to Australia and I took a trip to Greece. And those were the 2 coolest trips I've ever been on because
That's a good.
Australia and Greece, like, come on.
Come on.
And they were really with meaningful people. My trip to Australia was with my cousin and my aunt and uncle, and that was a lot of fun. And we got to go snorkeling on the Great Barrier Reef, and it was December, and so it was summer there. And so it was like awesome to kind of take a break from Washington in December and go to Australia in December. They have these things in like when you go to a national forest and they have the fire danger signs where it's like a rainbow of color to determine how the fire danger.
Yes.
You guys tracking with me?
I'm tracking.
They had those in like the center of town in Sydney to tell you how dangerous the UV radiation would be because like the sun is so hot there. Dude. And it was like in the extreme purple when we were there, and it was crazy. It was like the sun just was hotter than I've ever experienced before.
Crazy.
And then I went to Greece with one of my best friends like a year and a half ago, and that was also incredible. Everyone should do that.
And you survived.
And I survived. That was my first independent no, like I was gonna say no adults, but like I am an adult, but
no adults.
My first like international trip without adults. Older adults, adulty adults.
I said that the other day too. Something about like, oh, there's no adults here, so blah blah blah. And then my husband was like, well, I think that's us.
Exactly.
Was it like Mamma Mia the entire time?
No, but there were some Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants vibes that we got at times,
that's
you
good.
know. Oh, yeah. So
Never
good.
seen that movie.
It's a must. It's a must see.
It's a must see.
I'll have to.
There's 2 actually.
I would say
Both good.
I would say when I went to Italy when I was a junior in high school with my mom and the Catholic Archdiocese of Denver.
Yes.
On a pilgrimage, and it was amazing. Particularly, we went to Assisi, where St. Francis built his church, and that was one of the coolest experiences I've ever had. Yeah, I'll go with that. I mean, I've been to some other cool places as well, but I think that was my first trip out of the U.S. and it was really meaningful because like I got to see so many incredibly amazing, rich, like church heritage and cultural spaces. It was also with my mama. And I miss my mama right now.
Yeah. So. That's cool.
That is really cool.
This is like a hard question. I always have the hardest time with these questions that I think of.
You really do.
I've been on some very, very cool trips, very memorable, meaningful trips. Probably, I would say my first trip out of the country was we started in Paris and we followed along the Seine and we went to the south of France. We stopped in a bunch of places on the way. And it was right after I graduated high school and I had just taken 4 years of French. And so my grandparents take each of their grandkids on an international trip when they graduate. And so that was
cool.
like
That's awesome.
my trip. And so I went with the two of them and we had so much fun. They're like super special people and super adventurous and had traveled a lot. And so their kind of idea is like to show us how to travel and like how to do it well. And so they did a ton of fun things. And
that's so fun.
We went to so many places. It was a long trip and I got to use my French a lot. So that was fun.
Can you say something for us in French?
No, not anymore.
Nothing?
No,
Nothing at all?
Think so.
Can you say like bonjour? But like better than I can?
Sometimes I call Jono mon petit chouchou, which is little mushroom, little cabbage.
Oh, I was close. Sort of.
How did you almost get that?
I don't know. Petite is like small.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Chou kind of sound like mushroom, but like a vegetable. Same vibe.
Yeah. It's a really cute little term of endearment.
A little cabbage.
My little cabbage. It's like a thing in France, though. I didn't just make it up.
And it's fitting for Jono. He's a cute little cabbage.
He loves little things.
If there was a vegetable that represented Jono, cabbage is definitely not that one. Maybe asparagus or celery.
Wait, is it mon
Celery.
petit chouchou?
Yeah, chouchou. CHOU.
That was pretty good.
It's
I
like
feel
in Friends when Phoebe tries to teach Joey how to speak French.
Oh, yeah.
Oui poo poo. You know?
No.
Oh,
I've never seen it.
you
Never
would
seen
you would
Friends.
appreciate that as a French speaker or a former
As a
French speaker.
I wish. I took one day of class of French in college. And I was like, nope. Not in this place.
Really? Even after 4 years, it was just like a different experience?
Yeah. You walked in and she graded you in French and she said to you in French, we only speak French in this class.
You're like, all right.
And I was like, yeah, that's not where I'm at. It just wasn't God's plan for me.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
What a transition.
Wow.
That's why you get paid the big bucks.
Dear listeners, today what we are talking about is this idea of God's plan. So it was kind of an ingenious transition.
That was.
Hey,
Were
that
you
was.
planning that? Because that was.
I wasn't. I thought of it on the fly.
Wow.
But I feel really proud of me.
I'm-
You guys can't tell.
I'm impressed.
But yeah, we are going to talk about this idea of God's plan for our lives and kind of the restlessness around following that perfectly. It seems like a lot of times, especially when bad things happen or when we have big decisions to make, we'll use that phrase a lot, like, oh, that just must not have been God's plan for me, or I just really need to figure out what God's will is for my life in this decision or in this relationship or whatever it is. We kind of use that phrase a lot in our culture, but when you really start to look at it, it is kind of restless. I mean, it's a huge sentiment to talk about God's plan that way. And so we kind of want to break that down today and talk about what that means, what it looks like to follow God's plan for your life. And I just want to start off the conversation with asking, like, why do we want to take a look at it? Why is it kind of an important question to ask ourselves? Why do people talk about it so much?
Yeah, I think that it is important because I think that we all have notions about God's plan that we probably just kind of inherently believe, whether that's from how we grew up or how we've heard about God or maybe how we've interpreted his plan to be. And I think that it's important because it actually really affects our viewpoint of God or how we see God acting and how he is interacting in our lives. And so I feel like this question matters, at least off the top of the head. Like, I think that it matters for us just to be aware of how we believe God operates in our lives and how he desires our lives to unfold. Because I think we actually do have a lot of beliefs about that, even if we don't know we have a lot of beliefs about that.
Yeah,
Right.
Totally. And I think it's helpful too to say, like, in this conversation, because you can talk about God's plan in a very big sense. And like, we could get into the theology of God's plan, and we'll get a little bit into that. But kind of what we're talking about today is what you're saying, Josh, like God's plan for our lives in a very like personal, everyday decision kind of way.
Right.
Right. Like that's kind of what we want to tackle today.
Right. Like I'm thinking, I know we talk to a lot of students and a lot of people in our community who are kind of experiencing life decisions. And so something like, I'm trying to figure out what job I want to do after I graduate college. And I want to make sure whatever I decide is God's plan for me. Or I want to make sure that I know how to figure out what is God's plan so I can do that thing, whether that's dating, relationship, or a job, or what school to go to, or some of these things that are like life decisions that have an impact on our future that we desire to honor God in. How do we do that well? How do we do that right? Like, what are the implications of how we understand God to interact with us in that way? I think that makes me feel restless for sure.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and I think it is coming out of this experience that a lot of us who work with young adults, emerging adults, college, post-college, like it is a pretty much a continual conversation that we're having in some way, shape, or form. Like, and if it's not like it's not just about like university or career, it's about like, should I marry this person? Should I break up with this person? Should I live with this group of people or this person? Or should I move to wherever? There's just so many big decisions that are happening, like between the ages of 18 and 27, that this is a pretty much a constant pertinent question that is often being navigated. And so it feels very acute.
Yeah.
All of the time. So I think that's something that we're talking about. And the reason why I think it's so important to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I think that to some degree or another, it might be helpful to help define then what is God's plan. Like because it's something that we talk about so much and so often, as kind of people who do this pretty frequently with others, when you guys say, what is God's, like when someone says like, is this God's plan for my life? How is it that you respond most of the time?
That's a good question.
That is a good question. Yeah, that is a good question.
I think one of the first things that comes to my mind is to know him and to make him known.
Right.
That like God's plan for us is to know him, to be in relationship with God, and then out of that to make him known to the world. And that happens in the way that we live, in a way that reflects God's kingdom. That happens in the way that we go and make disciples, like the Great Commission says. That happens in the way our behavior interacts with other people. We get to do that in a lot of ways. That's not just like evangelism or explicitly sharing the gospel, but it's God's plan for us is to know God, to be in relationship with our loving and creative Father, and that out of that the making him known comes as we live in step with his kingdom. And that's what I tell people God's plan is, and God's will for our lives is that a lot of other stuff is secondary to that like big picture plan that God has for us.
Yeah, totally. I think the first thing that came to my mind is a similar phrase. It's kind of maybe just another way to say it, but is to love and be loved. To like accept the love of the Father and to let that guide your relationship with him and your identity, and then to go out and love others out of that. Like that is God's plan and that is God's will, that you do that in any circumstance that life leads you through, in any tragedy, in any season, anything. But I think a lot of times what people are actually asking when they're asking this question, and we talk a lot on this podcast about how important language is and kind of like getting the language correct around things, is more like, where is God's Spirit guiding me?
Yeah.
And I think that can vary. I mean, that is situational. That is personal. That is unique to each person and exactly what decision they're going through and exactly what season they're in. And God's Spirit does guide us and lead us toward things and away from things and all of that. And but when it comes to God's will and God's plan, there is an answer to what that is, and it doesn't change with the times, the seasons, or the person.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I think that you're both super correct in that. And I I think that the way we often think of God's plan is being very specific and very particular. And God's plan is for me to get married. God's plan is for me to be single. God's plan is for me to like get this job or move to this city or that city. And I think that that's how I've thought about it sometimes, but I think how I see it being thought about often is God's plan is this path. But I really think that you're right, kind of that he might have specific like leanings for you, and he might have some places where it's like, no, I'm more drawn this way, I'm feeling led this way, but ultimately none of those are his plan. Like his plan for you is to be in relationship with him so that he can bring about goodness in your life unto others. Like that's his plan for every single person that he's created. And I think like there's a lot of, I mean, personally, I find some freedom in that because I think that brings some recognition of like, I might make mistakes, but I can't get it wrong.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Like I might make choices like throughout life. I'm going to make mistakes. But I can't, like, if I'm pursuing the Lord, I can't go outside of his plan.
Because that in and of itself is his plan.
That is his
to
plan.
Pursue the Lord.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what I hear you guys saying is that it's a differentiation, and I think that's a super helpful idea to really draw out, is that God's plan is solely found within a friendship with God, of receiving the love of the Father, like being in a friendship with God, and then also making that known or showing that love to the world. Like that's the whole plan. What we're talking, like what, and that's really important to say, like God's plan for you is not hidden.
Yeah.
Like that is knowable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like Colossians 1:28, literally, like in this idea that the mystery that has been kept hidden from the ages and generations, but is now disclosed to the Lord, to the Lord's people. To them, God has chosen to make known among the Gentiles the glorious riches of the mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. Like you have been shown, God's mystery has been revealed. Like his plan for you is to experience his love and to show it. Like that's the whole plan. However, what most people mean when they say God's plan is like, what is am I supposed to do with my life?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Like in what, and so I think that is the point that we want to be sure that we're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
We want to talk about how do you discern and what does it look like for you to live out God's plan in particular contexts, right? That God's plan is not an external thing,
right?
Out there, like that you are trying
that you have to discover.
Yes, yeah. That is some mystery that you don't understand and you don't know. That's my bird clock for any of you guys.
We couldn't hear it.
This online. I'm at home right now, and then there's a bird clock that goes off in my house at the top of every hour. Anyhow,
that's amazing and so Shell-State-y.
Yes, it's true. But so like God's plan is not a mystery, like is not a mystery that's known, but the context or the way that and then my neighbor kid is here. I'll be right back.
I think one thing off of that is I think it's important to not just say, okay, yeah, we recognize that God's plan is this, but what do I do with my life? Like, I think sometimes I remember, like I spend so much of my week encouraging other people in this kind of thing and like kind of guiding other people and pointing other people in the truth of this. But then when it's my own life, it's, I think we all experience that. It's like a lot harder to sometimes remember the things for ourselves. And so I remember it wasn't that long ago. I don't even honestly remember the decision that I was making, but I was kind of going through this process of like, okay, am I supposed to do this or am I supposed to do this? Like, what is it that like the Lord has for me? And I think I was talking to you, Josh, at some point, and I was trying to process, like, I don't think God has clearly given me an answer of yes or no, and someone was encouraging me in the very thing that we're talking about. Someone was encouraging me, and they were saying, God's will for you is to know him and make him known. Like, just remember that is the most important thing. And I was like, yeah, I know that, but I want to figure it out. I want to figure out the right thing that is God's plan for me. And so I think just what you're saying, Garrett, I think is true and important, but I think it's also valuable to not separate them as much, because I think when I do that in my life, I have a tendency to almost neglect the big picture truth of God's will and God's plan for me. And I still want to find the right answer, but looking at it in a more holistic way, like you're kind of closing out your thought there before the dog, and saying, like, this is God's plan for me to know him, to love him, and to make him known. And through that, there are that has particular implications on, like, the decisions that I make in my life, that it's not this separate thing. And then there's my day-to-day decisions. Right. I think that's been helpful for me to process, because I kind of, the restlessness is really prevalent there.
Sure. Well, and the reason that I think it's important to go through that order is because then you're asking, in what context is best, or is God leading me to live out his plan for my life? That there is a way that we can find a particular space that sometimes God is calling us into to live out that context. But the issue is that if we think God's plan exists somewhere out there for us, then those external things will never fulfill the experience of being loved and showing love. Yes. And so when we are continually pressing into this spot where we're saying, what's God's plan for me is somewhere out there, it's external. Like it's rather than seeking the covenant or the friendship with God that we are being renewed by and sustained by, we're using all of our energy trying to figure out what God's plan is somewhere out there, rather than experiencing that and then discerning by God's Spirit, what context, God, are you directing or leading me to live your plan for my life?
Yeah, that's helpful.
Right?
Yeah, totally. And because that's so true, because it's just all context for this one purpose that is knowable, that is not hidden from you, that does not change throughout the seasons of your life. Everything else changes, and there's so many decisions. And to your point, Josh, you can make mistake after mistake after mistake, and it will not change that purpose. It'll just change the context through which you live it, and sometimes maybe how difficult it is to live it or whatever. And we'll get to talking too about, like, the ways that God's Spirit does guide and lead us. But I think that's a really helpful kind of word and way to think about it, G, is like that the rest is context.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Do I live out that context in singleness? Do I live out that context in this college, in this city, at this job, with this group of friends? Like, in what context am I living out this friendship?
Yeah. And there's a balance in that, because I think the importance of that and the beauty of that is your context matters, and of course you want to figure out what that context is for your life, but there's also a level of there's a balance of recognizing that you're free, that you get to live your life freely, not believing that you can you're gonna do it wrong, that you're gonna go down a path that God can't move in anymore, that you're excluded from his plan, that you're excluded from his will anymore. That is the thing that we get to be free from, that we often put on ourselves and add a whole lot more pressure. And I think that's not what God wants for us. He wants you to operate out of an abundance of knowing him and experiencing him, so that overflows into whatever context you're in. So there's this balance of recognizing there might be some contexts that are better for you in living out that plan, but that's really, it doesn't exclude anything. It might be
Right.
better in
Right.
terms of
Mhm.
like you might enjoy it more sometimes, or it might be a little easier here, or it might be more challenging for you in this season. But in all of it, God is bigger, and that He can
Yeah.
redirect whatever context you're in for His will, for His plan, and that gives us so much freedom, especially in a world where we're told you're defined by what you do.
Mhm.
You're defined by what you accomplish, what you achieve.
Yes.
And when when we have that truth of recognizing that that we're free from that defining us at all, and instead we just get to live our life, enjoy the life that God has given to us in any context we're in, and that we can live into His plan wherever that is. And I've had to learn that a lot because I've attached so much pressure to my career being the thing that accomplishes His plan for me.
Yeah.
And that just isn't true.
Right.
Yeah, one clarifier, there are particular contexts that you cannot live out God's plan.
Yes.
So, for example, you can't be in the Ku Klux Klan and work out your plan for God's life. That's just a context to not do that. Now, I mean, I guess if you were born into a Ku Klux Klan family and you are trying to navigate what that means, anyway, all I have to say is, if you're asking God, should I join the Ku Klux Klan? No, you shouldn't.
Right. Because we're saying it's under discipleship of Jesus that you can't mess up God's plan for you, because the
100%.
plan is to be a disciple of Jesus.
Yeah,
so
living into sin isn't His plan.
right. So
for
when
you.
you're not pursuing
Correct.
that, I think that's a good caveat.
Yeah.
Good clarifier there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. But it sounds
I
like
was just thinking through all the ways what people are oh, I could do that. I'm yeah.
not anything. Pursue
Yes,
discipleship
good
under
clarifier.
Jesus. Yeah, totally. I mean, it sounds like what you're saying, Josh, and I think is so true, is that there isn't a preordained path for you that is one step after the other. There's one way that it's supposed to look.
Yes.
And so what you're always trying to do is be what
Yes.
direction is my next step that's
Yes.
already planned for me.
Mhm.
Yes.
That's not the case. And I think
Yes.
that a good kind of illustration for that has helped me kind of see that is this idea of soulmates or whatever. If you're oh, is this the person I'm supposed to marry? Is this the one I'm supposed to marry? There's that doesn't even make sense, because we are human beings that have autonomy. And what if someone else decided to marry your one soulmate? Now
Right.
the whole world is messed up.
Yes.
Everything's off its axis. Nobody, And so I think that helps just illustrate that there isn't one certain way that you are supposed to do things.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, you have freedom of choice. You have freedom of let's apply it to jobs. You can be passionate about journalism, for example. Great. God could use the context of journalism for you. Taking different passions, you have the freedom to choose any of those.
Yes.
Rather than God being well, you got to go do, I don't know, marketing, but you hate marketing. But it's God's plan for your life, so just be obedient. And it's no,
Marketing.
that's not it. And this is important because the reason it's important is because it affects our belief about who God is and how He interacts in our lives. And it's not just this idea. It really does affect how we live in partnership with Him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yep. Cool.
In talking about God's plan a little bit, I think that something that I've been wondering and I've been looking at is kind of we should always go back to this, but what does Scripture actually talk about in relation to God's plan for our lives? And something that I thought was super interesting and super explicit as we were kind of planning for this was found in Romans 12. And what it says is this, it's verses, I believe it's verse 2. And it says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will." So it's a very explicit,
There you go.
hey, you want to know how to find out God's will? This is how. And what it says is, don't conform to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind in Christ. And so I think that what's interesting about that is, as we've been saying, that God's plan is for you to know Him so that He can use you to bless others in this world. But there's a level of God's plan first is to know Him.
Yes.
To be in friendship with Him, to be in intimate relationship with Him. And this is saying, like, rather than conforming to the ways of the world, the way, and that's not like, that's talking like in a sin context, of course, but that's also talking in a context of like any of the ways that the world chooses to operate outside of what God does. And instead it says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind as you seek out God. And if you do that, then as you're going through life, you'll actually be able to test and see what God's perfect will is for you, because you're actually like, you're in tune with the Lord. You're in tune with what he's doing in your heart. So I think an example of this that might make it a little bit more clear is I am engaged, and
snaps for
to
that.
the greatest fiance in the world. And I was, as I was like trying to discern, like, do I want to step in and like propose to May? Do I want to marry this girl? It wasn't a moment of like, I was praying and then God said, yes, Josh, that's it, for sure, do that. Instead, it was more of like, over the years of dating her, I was always in tune with God. I was following him. I was asking him questions. I was asking my community questions. And through that time, it was like I was able to discern what I believed God desired for me, in a sense of, is this something that lines up with what would be beneficial for me in your plan of knowing you and being a blessing to the world. And that happened through a process of actually following him and being transformed by the renewing of my mind, being in a relationship with him. And it wasn't like, all right, God, I've been going for 2 years and I haven't been listening to you, but I'm going to sit down now and I'm going to say, God, tell me exactly what to do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because we do that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But instead it was like, I was able to discern his good will for me by being in relationship with him and knowing what he actually desires and what he says is good.
Yeah, and I'll also add, just to like this specific example, that
Yes.
you had the ability to decide not to do that if
Yes.
you wanted to.
Yes.
Yes.
That just because this was a good thing that you'd been discerning and that you'd been walking through and that the Lord had blessed you with, and that like God's been moving in and through your relationship, like it doesn't mean that necessarily was, like Kenna was saying, like your soulmate, that
Yes.
you had the ability in that discernment with the Lord to also make a decision
Yes.
and have the freedom to choose like
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
for yourself.
And neither would have taken me outside of God's will.
Right.
Right.
That's right.
Yes. 100%. But in making a decision, like we've been saying, like at the end of the day, you still got to go, well, what do I do? Do I go do this or I do this? And the reality is neither takes you out of God's will for your life. So get rid of that pressure. But instead, it's more of the question of, does this line up? Like, is this lining up with what you want me to be about? Does this line up with who you're about? And honestly, do I desire it?
Right.
Like, do I
100%,
want to
yeah.
do this?
Yes.
And I think there's a lot of the times is we take our desire completely out of it and go, well, God, I want to walk blindly into going forward and just be 100% obedient. And sometimes God calls us into that. But I think there's also like following what you desire, because the Lord wants you to like live flourishingly in the world that he gave you and the life that he gave you.
I also will say one thing I hear a lot is it's just helpful, like you're saying, to have like some flesh on an example.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is for like, you say you're processing what you're experiencing in your life, and now you look back and you go, that was God's plan. Now, like now you look at the fact that you're engaged to May and you say, oh, okay, well, I can see now that this has
Yes.
been God's plan,
Yes.
as like an affirmation of a decision you've made.
Yeah.
And I think that's also an unhelpful way to look at things,
Yes.
because again, if you had decided not to, does that mean you weren't doing God's plan? No, that's not what that means. And so I think sometimes we look and we say whether like if things happen or don't happen, then after the fact, we look back and we say, well, that was God's plan because it did happen, or it wasn't God's plan because it didn't happen. And that just has a whole slew of implications.
Yes.
Once again,
Beyond it.
it's God's plan is for you to experience wholeness with him, and out of that abundance, experience that and share it, and discerning the context, oftentimes there's something specific, but oftentimes there's sometimes not.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it makes me think of, there's an analogy that definitely doesn't work out perfectly, but it does make me think of an analogy that we've heard elsewhere. And it's essentially this analogy of, like if like, I guess it would work best for Garrett and his kids, where let's say his kids go to
everyone here that has kids, it would work best for Garrett.
Yeah.
My kids are feral at times, so like they need some better boundaries. So.
But let's say they go up to him and they're like, "Dad, I want to go play in the backyard. I want to play." Let's say there's a like a playground there. You have a slide, you have swing, you have different things in there.
I actually do have a park in my backyard.
There you go.
Great.
This works perfect. And really the only rules for them is, hey, don't go outside of the fence in the yard. Like, just stay within the fence and enjoy the backyard. But what we often do is, let's say the kids were to go up to Garrett and say, "Dad, which one do I do? Do I do the swing or the slide? Should I do the swing or the slide? Swing or slide? Swing or slide?" And ultimately, as Garrett is a loving father, would say, it doesn't matter to me. Like, enjoy the playground. Like, just don't go outside the fence. Just stay within the fence, enjoy the playground. That is like my will for you in this, and do either the swing or the slide. And that's kind of what it reminds me too, as you're talking, Molly, is sometimes when we're faced with these decisions, we're like, all right, God, swing or slide, swing or slide, swing or slide. And I don't want to diminish the feeling of big decisions such as marriage or such as careers, because it's not like as simple as that. But I do think it's a helpful image of going, like, sometimes I think God's sitting there like, man, have fun, like enjoy your life, pick one and like go dive in and like live my will for you. And don't always live with like, man, what if I could have done that? What if I could have done that? Because that will always be the case.
Totally.
Yeah. I think it's the right question. I think asking this or this is sometimes the right question. I think it becomes challenging when the question prevents us from making a decision. When the question, swings or slide, is the only thing we're focusing on, and it prevents us from ever actually experiencing the thing that God has for us in general. Because sometimes he might say slide or swings, but sometimes when there is not one or the other, the question becomes debilitating. And yes, yeah.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about the story of like when the Spirit led Jesus into the desert. Like, most people are like given two options. They're like, fast 40 days in the desert, or like go hang out with your friends. Like, most people are gonna be like, I'm going to choose friends every single time. But so there is like an element to which I just want to elaborate on what you said, Miles, is that it's when we think the only way is to answer the question, swings or slides, right? That's when it becomes debilitating. Or we think that it's primarily answering the question, this or that, swings or slides. Yeah. What we're saying is that most of the time, or oftentimes, this is the way God operates. Have fun, choose a spot and work it out there for a way. But at times, he will say, go to the desert. You need to, but the only way you will do that is if you are connected, living God's will for you, God's plan for you, because then you can hear his Spirit leading you to the spot. Yeah. Like, if you read most of the Gospels, I want to make sure I say this right, because I'm actually not sure. I was about to say something that I wasn't sure about. I don't think it's as frequent where it says the Spirit led Jesus to this place or this place. Most of the time it just says, and then they went across the Sea of Galilee to the other side. Now, I think it could be implied that the Spirit was leading them that way, but it's not explicit. Like, I wonder if at times Jesus is like, yeah, let's just go over there. Like, and then we're going to work it out.
Yes.
Right.
You know? I think he absolutely did.
Yeah.
So I think that to me just helps, as we're talking about this, helps me solidify it, is that most of the time when we're saying, what's God's plan for me, we're trying to put God into a box of answer this or that question.
Right.
Do this, or should I do this or that? Or should I do this? And oftentimes what God is saying is, yo, just go have fun. And anything you choose is going to be great as long as it's inside this boundary set.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think something I want to say on that too, Garrett, that I think is important to say a little bit is well, I think Romans 12 is saying that because it's saying be connected with God, and then you'll be able to test and approve of his
Yes.
good and perfect will for you.
Yes.
But I think something else that I want to just tackle for a second is I think sometimes when we're talking about God's plan for us or God's will in our lives, we mix it with a different kind of theology that we put in, and I call it the everything happens for a reason theology. Yes. That basically, as you're going through life, anything that occurs to you is what God wanted for you. And I just want to say, as we're talking about this topic, that God doesn't want harm for you. Like, God doesn't want hurt for you, and God doesn't desire pain for you. Yeah. And I think that we have often taken on like, well, God made this thing happen to me so that something good can come out of it. And I don't believe that's how God operates. I think that's a very uncreative God that has to make bad things happen to you so that he can bring about his good plan. Yes. What I do believe is actually in Romans 8:28 is that God can work all things for his good. Yes. It doesn't, like, I don't think that that's saying that all things are done so that his good can occur. It's all things happen. like choice is involved. Good things happen, bad things happen to all people. But in the midst of that, God is so good and glorious and powerful that he can weave all of it into bringing good. But I just want to say that as we're talking about God's plan for our lives, that if there's something that has happened to you or you've experienced that has been harmful, first, I'm sorry that you've experienced that. But second, I just want to say that is not what God desired for you. Yes. And we know that because Jesus came and died on the cross so he could deliver us from sin, pain, and death. Yeah. And so,
right. Yeah. Otherwise, you would have to say that God wanted his son to die. Right? Like, would be a wild, like, especially everything we talk about God being love. God did not want his son to die. It was necessary for his son to die, but God's son did that of his own volition. Like, God wants beauty for you. The Psalms say, beauty out of ashes. Mm-hmm. Right? That God does make like beautiful stuff come out of like some of the most death and destruction. So, yeah. But God didn't will the death and destruction. He's powerful enough to bring resurrection out of death. Yeah. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, well, if you think about it, I think about God as a good father, and like, not to beat a dead horse of like the playground analogy, but I think it's a good one. It's useful in this conversation. And I think about, if God is the father in this analogy, his plan for the day, our lives, whatever, is to spend time together, is to go and play together. That's his plan. You still may ask like swing or slides. Swings or slide. And most of the time, like we're saying, he probably is going to say either one, like whatever. The plan is just to play together, whatever you want. But sometimes as a good father who knows you well, he may be like, you always choose swings, and I may suggest slide because I think that it's going to make you brave. Like, I think going up high and going down is going to cultivate in you what you want to be and what I want for you. And so I'm going to suggest maybe slide. And those are those moments where God's Spirit guides us. And we could say, yeah, I'm going to stick with swing. And it's not sin. It's not outside of his will. It's not outside of his plan for the day. We are still spending that time with him. Yeah. We're spending our lives with him, but he may suggest that we do slide. And so then we may do that, and we may actually fall because we're not used to it. And it's not that his plan was for us to fall. His plan was to cultivate bravery in us. His plan was to spend time with us. Like he wanted to guide us toward growth in love. And that doesn't mean that bad things don't happen. Even when he guided us or suggested something for our lives and we follow it, it doesn't mean that there's never, a negative outcome, but it doesn't mean it was his plan.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. That's a good distinction too, because sometimes where he guides us isn't always fun, like a swing or a slide.
Right.
Yes.
Sometimes it is monotonous or difficult, or life is just hard, but it does but in the midst of his plan is for you to be in a relationship with him.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
Right. That makes me think about the life of Jesus, that like if Jesus was the perfect example of, what we desire to live our lives like in Christ likeness, and if he was, of course, always in and living out God's plan, he still encountered things that were unpredictable. He encountered relationships that were difficult. He encountered situations that may have seemed like, unexpected. And that didn't mean that like Peter denying him and Judas betraying him, that like these things were necessarily a part of God's plan, but they all were a part of the story. And Jesus like experienced that. And it wasn't because Jesus was living in sin or because he had done something wrong that these things happened, or that God needed these things to happen in order for his plan to work itself out. But it's like, it's an existence in life that there are going to be things that we experience that are unexpected, that are unplanned, so to speak, that are challenging. And I don't know, it just made me think of like, Jesus didn't live this perfect life in the sense of nothing went wrong. That's not what Jesus living a perfect life meant.
Yes.
And so we can't expect that either. Like we can't expect perfect life in the same sense as Jesus, but in our desire to be holy and Christ-like, that doesn't mean that we will not experience things that are challenging or that are frustrating or where we fall and we have to get back up on the way.
Yeah.
Totally.
Love it so much.
Yeah. And also, if we think about this, I just love this analogy. This analogy is very useful, Josh. I know I was kind of like ripping on it before we started, but if you allow it to
breathe.
expansion,
Nuance.
it's got some, my favorite word in the world.
Give on it,
It's very useful. I mean, like with the example that I just gave where God, suggests like, what if you try out the slide? I think that is also helpful to think about in that, because we've talked about when people are asking this question, it's because they have a restlessness around a decision in their lives.
Yes.
And we've spent a lot of time talking about how to not pay too much attention to that, because there is a greater plan for your life that you can live out in any context. And that is so important. And I do think it actually takes away a lot of the restlessness of decisions, but there are still decisions to make in life. And one of the things that I want to just pose to us and to people listening is that God does really, really care about the details of your life.
Yes.
He really, really does care about your desires. Like we've talked about, he really does care about the way that you are developed into Christ likeness, what context is going to be best and most helpful for that. And he does give guidance. And what I hear from people a lot is like, I have this decision to make and I'm not hearing anything from God about it. And we had talked about how sometimes that's because it's totally up to you. It's totally your choice. But also sometimes I don't think that we are open to the ways that God is speaking to us.
Yes.
I think a lot of times we have an expectation that there is one way that he will make it clear. Like he will just make it so that we are not offered the job that we're not supposed to take, quote unquote. Or this person will just break up with us if it's a relationship we're, quote unquote, not supposed to be in. And that's just not true. That's just not true.
Say that.
Our expectations of how God speaks to us or should speak to us or we want him to speak to us don't dictate how he necessarily will speak to us. And so I think it's an important question to ask ourselves is like, how am I expecting God to talk to me? And just maybe that's not the way. Maybe he isn't going to take, uproot the whole swing set and take it out of the yard because he doesn't want us to swing. Maybe he suggests slide, but it's not in this like big flashy way of taking every other option off the table. And so I think an important part of this conversation about God's will, God's plan, and discerning decisions is also a conversation about listening well.
Yes.
Yeah, that's so good.
So I have two thoughts on that, and that's so good, Ken. One, I remember, I'll say this, is that it reminds me of the story of Elijah in 1 Kings 19. Just to paraphrase the story, like God's people are messing up. Elijah's trying to help them not mess up. And so he there's this really intense showdown between him and his enemy, and whatever. It's intense and kind of bloody and gory.
I love this paraphrase. It's an intense showdown.
But essentially, God shows up in a profound way, undoubtedly profound, intervenes in Elijah's life to show that he has the power to do the thing that Elijah is hoping for in God's people. But then Elijah just leaves. One, he's kind of scared for his life because his enemy was really powerful. And he just goes up to this mountain, and then he gets there after this really long hike. He's really exhausted. He gets into this mouth of this cave, and then it just says a voice, God's voice said, "Hey, Elijah, what are you doing here?" And he answers. He's like, I'm trying to help your people out and help them not suck so bad. And it's hard. and then the voice says, "Okay, Elijah, here's the thing. I want you to go stand out on the mouth of the cave because God's presence is about to come by." And it says, "Go out and stand," this is verse 11 in chapter 19 of 1 Kings. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." The great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood on the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The idea, that I think is so and I think this passage encapsulates that so well, is that Elijah just saw God move in this profound way, like a fire from heaven. And he's expecting God to show up that way again, over and over again. But God's voice is always a small whisper. God's activity can be big. The way he intervenes could be big. But the way he is speaking is a whisper. It's the reason we say in the Christian tradition that in order to hear God's voice, you have to silence everything. Because God wants such an intimate friendship with you. He speaks in a whisper so he might draw you closer to him. And it's so
right.
Yes, that idea that it only can happen this way or it only can happen that way. It's no, God is speaking in a whisper. Can you get quiet enough to hear him?
Yep.
Now, that doesn't change the fact that sometimes you still don't hear anything, which I don't know what to do. Like every time that happens in my life, I'm like, okay. But I was thinking of a time in my life. I had gotten fired from my second church. Felt great, but not like the church was running out of money, and so but I still was part of this church community, and so I was trying to figure out what to do next. And I was I had applied to a bunch of grad schools and I didn't get in. And I was like, what in the what? I had this vision of what I was supposed to do with my life. And I went on this retreat. We called it Dudes in Igloos. And a bunch of dudes from the church went up into the mountains of Colorado and we built snow caves and we slept in them for 3 days. And it was intense. But I remember being it's gonna be like 1 Kings. I'm gonna go up and hear the whisper of God. And I go up and I'm like it was freezing outside. There was a huge wind. It was a bunch of snow. And I get up there and I'm just sitting there. And I'm sitting there listening to God. For hours, it felt just God, I'm not moving until you freaking talk to me about what my family and I are supposed to do next. And the first thing I heard God say was he said, "Garrett, I need you to know that you're my son."
Oof. And
I'm like, okay. He's like, "That's all I need you to work on. Just know that you're my son." And I'm like, "Oh, cool. Thanks." And then the next
you're
thing
not what I asked.
Yeah, I'm I want to know how I'm supposed to make money, God. And then he goes, and then the next thing he said is "And I need you to heal." And I was like, oh gosh. And because I just gotten like thrown through the ringer. And that was God's plan for me in that season.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked God, what am I supposed to put my hand to? Like, okay, like I can do all of that, but in what context am I supposed to work out this healing and this sonship? And he just told me to write music and to record an album. I've recorded one worship album in my entire life. And it was because of that. And it was the most healing experience. Because it let me work out my identity in Christ and all of this. And, it took me almost 4 years to get that process done. And I worked at a church for part-time. I worked for, I worked in the service industry. And once that all kind of began to get healed in me, at the end of that season, a friend of mine at the end of that season called me and he's like, yo, Garrett, I got this thing called Ecclesia out in Bellingham, Washington. Would you be interested? Now that doesn't mean that because it wasn't a cause and effect. It wasn't I did that stuff and so then the next thing happened. Because there was a lot of, as we noted, there was a lot of wills and stuff. But all of a sudden, when I became the type of person that could hear and listen, all of a sudden I was able to see the opportunities that God was actually bringing in front of me, so that's how I interpreted all of that.
That is so good. I love the last thing you said there, when I became the type of person who could hear and listen. And I think sometimes we want to hear God, but we're not postured in a way to do that. And I want to be careful not to say something that is going to be harmful, but I think sometimes our sin and our rejection of God and our posture away from him can actually prevent us from hearing him. And I want to intentionally say that it is not a cause and effect thing, as in our sin causes God to stop speaking. Yes. That is not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that God's presence is conditional on our behavior. That it's not true. God's presence and his voice is not conditional on our goodness or our good behavior. God is always speaking, he's always present, no matter how much we reject him. But if we're postured in a way where we are pushing away and we are turning ourselves away from God, it's going to be a lot harder to hear him. It would literally be like I'm putting on headphones, I walk out of the room, and I still expect to hear Kenna talking to me from 100 feet away. Mm-hmm. It's just more difficult. Kenna's still talking. She's still saying the same stuff. She still loves me. She still cares about me. But I have put myself in a position where it is difficult to hear. And I think sometimes, and I'm still frustrated. I'm like, why can't I hear her? Why can't I hear? Why isn't she talking to me? And I think if you're in a season maybe where you want to hear God and yet you're rejecting him, I think part of the invitation is to just begin to draw nearer, begin to turn towards the Lord. And I think that is sometimes the most important first step as far as beginning to hear him and hear his voice. But I think in all that, we've talked about really good stuff, and I think sometimes we can get a little bit big picture, but I want to know, how do I actually decide the thing that I need to decide? I'm looking for this job. I want to know if I'm supposed to date this person. I need to make a decision. And I think there's some practical things that we can encourage people in. How do I make that decision?
Yeah.
How do I do it?
Yeah. Here's what I'd say. I mean, just building off what you said, is that the best way to discover the best way to discover God's plan for you is to actually live into God's plan for you, which what we said was, once again, experience God's friendship. And if you're not actively cultivating that, the context by which God is guiding you perhaps to live out that is going to be murky. But if there is let's just take the analogy back again. to the spot where we're like, okay, you really do feel like God has a specific context by which his plan is going to be worked out in your life. Like you have a space or an experience or a way of operating that you're trying to discern. I think that that's the best. Some of the language to put around it is that you are discerning the context where God wants you to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, as it would say in Philippians, right? So the first thing is this. One of the first things I'd say is be clear about your expectations. In what way are you expecting God to say it to you? And then decide if those are fair expectations or not. I would say that probably they aren't, so let them go. So like let go whatever expectation that you are putting on God to speak, like just let them go. Like just open your hands, let those sons go. Second one is this. Be really clear about your question. So like, for example, Ken, if you're like, am I supposed to am I supposed to move to this place? Like, am I supposed to move to Santa Cruz, California? Ken is not moving to Santa Cruz, California.
I don't even know where that is.
But like, be clear. Like, okay, so have a really clear question in mind. Am I supposed to apply for the teaching internship at this one place? Okay, that's number 2. Have a clear question. 3, have a clear community that is joining you.
Yes.
Yeah.
In discerning that question for a period of time.
Yeah.
Say, hey, will you spend the next 3 weeks discerning with me? And then you talk with them about the things that you're experiencing in your connection time with God, what they're doing on your behalf, and you come together and you talk, like, and everyone says, like, I'm not getting anything. Like, then you might be more of it in a playground, like, choose the swing or slide. Or maybe you get a lot of people being like, no, I really don't think that you're supposed to take that. And you feel that too, and then you're like, no, I guess that it's not supposed to that. There is a lot of ways to do that, and then that way you get to bring in God's community, other people's perspectives on trying to discern the context by which God's will is supposed to be worked out in your life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good, G. I'd also say that you can't waste your time. Let go of the fear that you're going to waste your time if you do something that ends up not being what you want to do. Like, for me, like I got a degree in elementary education, and I probably will never use it in the way that it was meant for. Yeah. And I don't look at that, though, as a waste of my time, that I spent that time going like, man, I just totally made the wrong decision and I wasted all that time of those years. Like, I became a person in that time. Like, I learned valuable skills. Like, it got me to where I am today. And so, one, I'd say in whatever decision you have to make, like, you're not going to waste your time.
Yes.
That I think, even G, how you were asking the question sometimes, I think, what am I supposed to do? I think is sometimes like, I see what we're saying when we ask that, but I think sometimes it's like, it
like,
might
like,
be
do
something.
you have a suggestion?
Yes. And I think that often, what I liked that you said was that God is saying something completely different. And if we're not letting go of our expectations or letting go of the voice or the answer that we want from him, then we can't even hear the third answer that he's given to us.
Yeah.
But the other thing I'd say is I'd caution to make your desires what God is doing for you, like to conflate those two things. I'd caution you to say like, well, God wanted me to do this, but honestly, you want to do this.
Yeah.
Like, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Yeah. I would just caution going on like, this is for sure what God 100% wants me to do because he told me so. And in reality, when he told you so, you just wanted to.
Especially when you're breaking up with someone.
Yes, especially.
Why do we say that in like every couple podcast?
Yes, especially when you're breaking up with someone.
Stop saying God told you to break up with someone.
Yes.
Even if it's true.
Yes.
It's true.
Yes. Instead,
Don't
own
say
it. Yes. Instead, like own your decisions for what your decisions are.
Yeah.
But I think the last thing I'd say of how do I actually make a decision, let go of the expectation for certainty. I would say that almost every single time you're not going to be certain. And so if you're asking God for certainty in a decision, you're probably not going to get it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And instead, follow the place that you feel most conviction from the Lord, that lines up with your desire, that lines up with goodness for yourself and others, that lines up with what your community's saying, and then walk, like take a step. And I think sometimes we don't take a step until we get the certainty. And the whole time God's been like, man, I've been giving you the answer for 7 years now. Like you got to walk. And I think sometimes that we are waiting for certainty, and in the whole time we're not actually listening.
Yeah, totally. I think that we have a lot of fear around mistakes or regret that we get to just give up because of what we're saying here, which is that you cannot mess up or derail God's plan for you as long as you are pursuing discipleship to Jesus. That is God's plan for you. And so if in that you go to a grad school that ended up being awful and so hard, you could actually regret that. You can be like, I kind of wish I hadn't made that decision, but you won't have thrown off God's entire plan for your life.
Yes.
And so I think we should also let go of fear of mistakes or regret. That is part of life. That is okay. And God will be with you and you will be living out God's plan for you in discipleship to Jesus.
Yeah. And I'd also say, I think that if you are trying to make a decision and you find yourself just like distraught with trying to figure out what is right, whether that is, do I move here or here? Do I do this or that, job or no job? Like, and you are like, I've been praying and praying and praying and I just cannot figure it out. I think my encouragement to you would be, you have the freedom. Like, and the reason why I say that is because God is not a puzzle, and his plan is not a problem to be solved. And if you are doing all these things that we've been talking about, posturing yourself in a way to hear him, living in community, being intentional, I'm hesitant to say this, but it won't be that difficult to where you cannot figure it out.
Yes.
God is not going to hide himself from you. He does not desire to give us this like mystery to solve in order to figure out if we can live the right way for him or not. Like, he's not a puzzle. He has revealed the thing that he wants us to do, and then we get to walk in that. And so that's my encouragement. There's a scripture that I love in Jeremiah 29 that says, like, God says, I will be found by you when you seek me with all of your heart. And like, God is ready for us to find him when we seek him. Like, he is not hiding. He is not making himself like scarce, but he is ready to be found by us when we seek him.
It's good, Molly.
So good.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, like it, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you can stay tuned for all of our content.